Okay, so this is your fifth video lecture on the chapter of adolescence. In the previous lecture, we were talking about identity formation, Erickson's models. I just want to briefly talk about a couple more identity concepts, and then we'll go on to more of the socio-emotional stuff of adolescence. So I don't believe the current orange textbook, and I say orange because it's got orange lettering, includes a discussion of what's called spiritual identity formation. It does discuss racial and ethnic identity formation. Basically, both of these refer to different elements of like the who I am question, right? Identity formation is figuring out who I am, my place in society. Identity and ethnic formation is about most of the research on racial-based identity formation is done on immigrants or children of first and second generational immigrants, how they assimilate, how they think of themselves. Do they think of themselves as the ethnic group of their people of origin? Do they think of themselves as Americanized? And then all of those different, so the same way we had those 4 stages of identity formation over here, where you go from achievement, foreclosure, moratorium, diffusion, or all of these options. We also have those elements when it comes to who I am. So who I am in terms of racial and spiritual, and this is the time where young people would be exploring that. They would be deciding how much of their ethnic identity they want to bring with them. They would probably have experienced during this time, maybe in the home, they're still speaking their mother tongue, but yeah, when they speak their mother tongue amongst their peers make fun of them. So do they embrace their heritage or do they turn away, right? And that can come with a lot of psychic and emotional effort goes into figuring all that out. Same thing with spiritual identity formation, right? And what this does is it offers 3 terms that if you Google spiritual identity formation, but the notion is we go from the first stage is accepting a higher power. You reflect on the different views, right? So maybe you experiment. I always think of, when I think of spiritual identity formation, when I was in middle school, I was actively going to different churches. It was kind of because that's where my best friends went. So I went to some very fundamentalist evangelical churches. I went to some very, they would call high churches, with a lot of, like the Catholic Church would be considered a high church because you do the stand up and the sit down. The fundamentalists, where they speak in tongues and they have drums and all of these things. So that would be an example of active, right, where you're or identity achievement, and then at the end of that settled on this is the way I practice my spirituality, which would be called the conjunctive stage. So that's really all of these slides are about, is it acknowledges that part of our identity is not just political and gender, but it's also your racial, your ethnic identity, your spiritual identity. And it is healthy and appropriate to explore all of those things during your adolescence. So for instance, maybe your parents have raised you to go to church every Sunday, and you decide around 16 or 15 you ain't going anymore. That is a normal process of spiritual identity formation, right? You may declare yourself a Buddhist or an atheist, right? That's a normal process. That really is one of the important parts that I want to emphasize about this chapter, and that's one of the terms that's on this particular slide, is this word right here, which is individuation. And this is what is supposed to happen during this period, is we are supposed to, teenagers, adolescents, whatever, is supposed to find their own place. So this refers to the time in which a young person turns away from their parents and reorganizes their significant relationships. Parents are supposed to become less important during this time. Peers become more important at this time. I'd like to use the example that imagine you, the 17-year-old, felt the same way about your parents at 17 that you did when you were 7, right? For most of us, I think, maybe if we were lucky, when we were 7 years old, our parents could do no wrong, right? They were the most important people. They were the smartest people, right? And imagine if you were as dependent upon them at 17 that you were at 7. You would probably not leave home, probably not family form, probably not launch. But imagine if your parents thought of you the same way at 17 that they did when you were 7, if they adored you. You know, I think about my daughter when she was a child, she could walk. As a joke, my friends told, you know, that Sarah's daughter can walk on water. She could do no wrong. She was perfect. Had she remained perfect, I'm 21, she ain't perfect right now, right? Had she remained perfect and never done anything wrong in my eyes, she'd still be living with me. But that's not what you're supposed to leave your parents. You're supposed to leave your nest. So this, what sometimes is called, you know, here it is down here, the adolescent rebellion or the teenage rebellion. That the rebellion term, the negative connotation that we give to that is socially constructed. Not all cultures regard this time, this teenage, and there it is, adolescent rebellion. Not all cultures regard it as a bad thing, right? In other cultures, so for instance, in the Amish tradition, it's called Romspringer, and it means run around. And it is the time that the parents say, you go out there and you try all those new things, and then you decide what you want. Of course, parents are always hoping their children come back home, right? Because it's not a period of conflict. It's a rite of passage. It's a normal thing that we're supposed to do. And how we parent, right? Our parenting style, that's what's down here. The parenting style that we have hopefully used up until this point will predict how well the stage of adolescence goes or how badly it goes. If we have parented in a warm, responsive way, and we give space to our children to become, you know, the adults that they will eventually become, it can have less conflict. If we're very strict and very punitive and expect, you know, unquestionable reverence and never question me, it's going to be pretty hard because that's not what happens, right? What happens during this stage is, so there's some other terms on here called time use, right? Where our children begin to spend time. Now, I will not deny that as my now old adolescent young adult spends less and less time with me, I miss her. I get kind of sad and kind of jealous, but this is what's supposed to happen, right? Okay. So other things that happen during this period, yeah, that's really what all the slide talks about is all the fancy terms: individuation, time use, and how this can create conflict, but that conflict it's not universal. It's not universal. The change is universal, but if there's conflict, that doesn't have to be. Okay, another slide with some terms. We have what's called reference groups and social comparisons. Because we have developed the ability to think abstractly, we begin to compare ourselves to others, and we get to adolescence and we begin to sort each other out. That's what these terms just refer to, different ways that social sciences has attempted to measure and attempted to categorize. So you might have like the big crowd. And I don't know how this works if you have a very small school with a graduating class of 23. I think it's harder to imagine. But in my class, where I had 300 and some odd students, you had, you know, the crowds of, say, the nerds. And within that group, I had a clique of the people who were on the forensics team. But there were also the theater students, and there were also, you know, the Scholars Bowl students. But my clique was the debate team. I can think of my daughter had 500 in her class, right? So her crowd would have been like the choir crowd, but within the choir crowd, she had a smaller group of people that would be her clique. And then sex cleavage just refers to how we start to sort each other. Like in middle school, we have boys and girls, and then that begins to meld away. when you get a little bit older. Some other terms, I believe I read on one of your quizzes that there's a question about researchers have figured out a way to measure popularity amongst peers. And the answer, I think, is a true false question. The answer to that quiz question, I'll say that another way, the answer to that quiz question is true. And they are qualitative experiments, or they are qualitative analyses, and they ask children to rank, right? To rank which children they like, or I forget the term, I forget exactly the language that they use, but basically they ask one child to rank people, they ask another child to rank people, and these are all in private. They ask another child to rank people, and then they notice the pattern, which children are at the top and which children are at the bottom. And so we can precisely measure popularity, right? And then there's some fancy terms that are given to these children. You have the controversial students, the adolescents, some they're liked, some disliked, rejected ones, they're actively disliked, like we don't like that person. And then you have the neglected peers, which these are the ones that are simply overlooked. In sociology, we talk about nations being like this. You have the core nations where everybody where they interact with each other, and then you have the peripheral nations, and then there are nations on that map over there on my wall where you probably wouldn't even know the names of them. Those would be like the neglected adolescents. Okay, I'm at my 10-minute mark. I'm going to stop with this one and have 2 slides left on the last video lecture.